Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our LinkedIn Live series. My name is Kate Meisner. I'm our U.S. Head of External Affairs, subbing in for Lisa Ross today, who was unable to make it due to technical difficulties. I'm here with Frank Figliuzzi, former Assistant Director at the FBI. We've got a lot to talk about today, Frank. Obviously have been through a lot in the past couple of weeks. We've already in the past early weeks of 2021 been through an unlawful siege of Capitol Hill. We've been through the acute impact and ongoing impact of a global pandemic. We've been through impeachment proceedings, and of course, these undercurrents that we're all facing of a tattered and hyper-partisan information environment. So we're looking forward to having a robust conversation with you about the state of information bankruptcy, the challenges America faces with misinformation, disinformation, domestic extremism, and foreign interference, which of course are nothing new to you given the long career that you've had. And my first question for you is really looking at this year's trust barometer that we just put out in the US. You've spent your career at the FBI, an institution that's predicated on trust, on the adherence to shared values. What really stuck out to you?
Yeah, if you look through the barometer, there's a couple of obvious things, but then I want to talk about the nuances with them. So, for example, clearly government took a heavy hit in terms of trust. We can all see that in a glaring way on the barometer. But what struck my attention was the speed with which it happened. And I think that serves as a reminder to all of us across any industry that this can happen to you, and it can happen very, very quickly. You can stumble and fall quickly, and you need to be aware that in this amplified environment, one step could cause a significant fall.
That's, such an important takeaway for the corporate executives we serve. Let's talk specifically about the attacks on the Capitol a couple of weeks ago. You've seen things like this from the other side in your time at the FBI. What's your take on how we got here? Sort of these broader undercurrents of extremism and hyper-partisanship, which are of course related, and how we and our audience of business leaders can help address them.
Yeah, let's start with that second half first, because one of the things that jumped out at me, to go back to your first question, with the general barometer, was that business has a tremendous opportunity here. Business suffered the lowest decline in trust and is now the most trusted element in the barometer. So there is a window to seize here, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, January 6th, unprecedented event for our nation, fueled largely by fabricated, false social media in this amplified echo chamber that we're in. But here's the message, not to sound overly pessimistic, but this deep threat of violence, this extremism, is not looking like it's going to go away simply because the occupant of the Oval Office has gone away. So that means business leaders, government leaders, all sectors need to think about how this works now, how to address it now, and in the foreseeable future. And there's clearly a role for business to play here.
What would you say that role looks like? Just if you look at our trust barometer, CEOs are among the most trusted source of information for their employees, more trusted, particularly more trusted across both those who voted for Trump and those who voted for Biden. So if you're looking at that as a business leader, how do you think about it? And I know you spent years counseling executives at GE on this exact topic. So looking at this year's barometer, how do we go forward from here?
Look, the FBI, and I've written a book about this, the FBI, more than any other institution in government, lives and dies by its brand, its reputation, its perception, and they safeguard like any threat is an existential threat. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. But one of the things I write about in the book, I talk about code. Code flows from core values, and I think this is a time for business leaders to dust off those core values, that mission statement that you have perhaps even on the wall of your office, and actually consider revisions or amendments to it or resending it out in a discussion with all employees. Here's why. More than ever before, those core values have got to reflect emphasis on truth, transparency, and fact. And the code of conduct for your organization needs to now clearly articulate, these are things we stand for, and here are some things we will not stand for. Amplification of unvetted data, incivility in our workplace or toward our customers, right? So today, being a good global corporate citizen now means more than ever articulating our code of conduct. We stand for truth, fact, and transparency. We do not tolerate or stand for incivility, talk of violence, or disrespect for each other or those around us.
And a finding borne out by this year's barometer, which found that the number one thing business leaders and businesses can do to increase trust is actually to serve as an information guardian. So really interesting finding that fundamentally sort of starts to shift the role of business in our community. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of information bankruptcy. We're in a place where trust, particularly in the opinion leader ecosystem and in our broader information hygiene, is in tatters. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen over the years, how we got to this moment, right? A lot of this is unmonitored French communities online. This is obviously not a new threat, but it is something that has gotten much larger in recent years. So tell us a little bit about how we got to this moment.
It didn't happen overnight. As it appears, it happened stunningly fast, but it wasn't overnight. And the role of social media and disinformation, this cannot be overemphasized. And I want to springboard into what that means internally at your company for your clients. But let's understand something. We are living in echo chambers, and we are more polarized than ever before. People get their news from traditionally now one source only and refuse to watch and learn from any other sources. So businesses have an opportunity to here, since the barometer says people trust their CEO, they trust their employer, and then globally, they tend to trust corporations more than any other element. It's time for you to seize that moment and come out and say, we will not associate with disinformation platforms. We will not even get polarized or get near polarization politically, because we're not going to contribute to this political environment right now. We are separate and apart and above this. And the more businesses can do that and disassociate and do some due diligence on your associations. You don't want any surprises right now. You don't want the front page of the paper to say, hey, this manager in this part of my company attended the insurrection, or we found out that we support a platform that's being used for an extremist violent site or chat room. Do your homework, do your due diligence, disassociate, stay above the fray.
What happens in terms of the flip side of that, right? Which is, as a brand, your conversation, the conversation about you, is showing up in all kinds of new places. You know, it starts with government. We see a lot of things that start in the political ecosystem and then ultimately translate into brand communications. So what is the one step ahead that business leaders need to be taking in order to stay in front of disinformation about their company and their brand potentially being spread online?
Yeah, I think we need to step up the game in terms of proactive communications right now, and look around the company, talk to your leaders and say, where are we exposed? Where are we vulnerable? Get your corporate security leader into that discussion. Get your IT security leader into that discussion. And from my experience in the government, and then 5 years as a corporate security executive with what was then a Fortune 10 company, I can tell you, there will be some surprises when you ask these questions. You will find, particularly if you're a global company, you will find people on your server, in your network, employees and contractors, having extremely disturbing conversations, posting extremely partisan, even perhaps violent extremist videos. The question has to be asked, what are you doing internally first to monitor communications within your framework and software abilities? Sit down, have that discussion. You don't want something being attributed back to your company as the source of that kind of communication.
Yeah, very serious stuff. We've talked a lot about business, Frank. I'd love to talk a little bit about government, actually, given your long service to multiple American presidents, presidents of both parties. We have a new president now. He's stated that his mandate is to rebuild trust with the American people. You saw in the barometer that it's bifurcated along party lines. Republicans in particular have dropped their trust in government over the past several months since the election. If you're Joe Biden, how do you start to rebuild trust among people, particularly in this information environment?
So what I've said on my many television commentaries during this unfortunate time is that what I've seen happen here over the last 4 years is a kind of radicalization of thought that looks eerily similar to what we've seen even in international terrorism investigations. And so the question becomes, how do you de-radicalize? How do you get better? How do you get healthier? And it's exposure to sunshine. It's exposure to the truth. So if you're the incoming Biden administration and you have to think about everything more than ever that comes out of your mouth publicly in terms of, will this polarize? How will this be received or not? And what are we going to do to show people the benefit of the truth? So you may not have voted for me, or if you're a CEO, you may not like my company, but here's how we benefit you. For example, the Biden administration may say, does someone in your family need health care? Would someone in your family like to go to college for free? Might that help you? All of a sudden, you have people going, oh, wait a minute, I don't like you, but I like that idea. And so exposure to truth and sunshine. But it's easy to say, but hard to do because we're all migrating to these echo chambers, right? And now as we take down sites, as people take down their apps that support sites like Parler, we run the risk of forcing people into the darker and darker recesses of the internet. We now know they're migrating to encrypted communications and sites, and that makes it harder for them to see sunshine and for law enforcement to see them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that gets to another question that we've been asking again and again, right? You've seen Parler get shut off of specific platforms. You're seeing platforms take much more stringent approaches, but we know that the conversation doesn't die just because the platforms no longer accommodate it. Where does it go from here? Tell us a little bit about some of those platforms that we might see emerging, and particularly, same question as before, what we can do, what business leaders can do to avoid the spread of mis and disinformation.
Well, I know that in the companies I consult with and in my own corporate experience, we had some pretty sophisticated filters that didn't allow employees to go there. And the obvious kind of low-hanging fruit was pornography, gambling sites, that kind of sophistication. But it was getting more and more detailed and more nuanced. And I think it's time, if you don't have that in place, to consider that, because it's something that can spread like an infection around your company if people are passing around postings and even getting on extremist violent sites while they're at work. So it's time to reconsider internal usage policies and your ability to monitor and detect proactively. Your role again is truth, accuracy, and overemphasis on transparency. And that's all hands on deck. That's not just the security or IT issue. That's an HR emphasis. That's labor and employment law. That's comms, all working together. And certainly it's general counsel's office, all working together to get this right, make sure people aren't feeling oppressed or censored, but also being clear to your employees, we're not talking about oppression and censorship. We're talking about a bright line that we will not cross: violence, disrespect, incivility.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense and gets to what you were saying before, Frank. I'd love to talk a little bit about another barometer finding, which is that trust outside of the US for US corporations has dropped dramatically over the past several years. We've gone from, being in the blue category, which means you're trusted. Your trust is above 50 points with other countries that we consider to be peers like Canada, Germany, France, the UK. Now we're actually in the red in terms of trust globally. And that gets us to a really interesting environment in terms of geopolitics, particularly as it relates to the regulation of these online platforms. We're seeing more and more platforms emerge, WeChat and others, that are global in nature, gaining a foothold in the US. So how do we make sure that we're protecting ourselves from national security threats, while also keeping in mind the broader geopolitical context here? And what can brands do to protect their IP and customer data in this environment?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Let me try.
Sorry about that.
Let me try to hit the highlights. But it's funny because coming out of the intelligence community, what I'm seeing now with businesses who do business globally in this environment with a lack of trust looks a lot like our allies' lack of trust in the intelligence community of the US agencies, right? We've lived through a period where UK, Australia, Canada, they're looking at us going, could we share that secret information that we usually share with the US partners, but maybe we shouldn't share it with them now? The same thing's happening on a global business scale, and you need to understand that and work extremely hard. And it gets harder because you may have limited travel policy now because of the COVID virus. So where you would go visit your international stakeholders and partners, you might not be doing that more, but you need to engage now more than ever. With regard to, let's talk about something near and dear to my heart, both insider threat and IP protection in this environment. First, you know that President Trump, near his departure, had banned and regulated things like WeChat and other sites that he correctly viewed as being exploited by foreign intelligence services. I'm here to tell you that that was accurate. WeChat is something I see in my experience. Is when you're at a deal making stage with a Chinese industry and your client, your partner tells you, hey, let's switch over for convenience to WeChat, be careful, because that means you are now fully exposed to the Chinese government, who owns the infrastructure and the domain. So you've got to be extremely careful about that. Additionally, we are seeing more than ever before cyber attacks aimed at getting your intellectual property. So you get what you pay for in IT security. It's time to step up and pay for enhancements there and close down your research that's accessible to on people who should not be looking at it. Close it down internally, and understand there's something that jumped out at me in the barometer about insider threat. Here it is. There's a page in there that says that one of Americans' greatest fears is loss of job. And there is study after study that shows fear of loss of job is absolutely directly linked to theft of intellectual property. Your employees are more prone than ever before in recent history to squirrel away that formula, business strategy, that research design, because they need an insurance policy moving forward. The more uncertain and anxious they are, the more likely they are to do damage to you internally. That needs to get out in the open on that. If you can reduce anxiety levels, you reduce the risk of insider theft.
That's fascinating. I mean, if you think about the calculus for a corporate leader, right, you're balancing, okay, first of all, you need to mitigate those threats. They're threats. We can't ignore them. But then there's also the flip side of that, which is, how do you build trust? How do you make sure that your employees do feel secure? How do you make sure that broader society, which increasingly our barometer shows business is responsible for, as the only institution that is viewed as both competent and having integrity, how do you make sure that you're sort of propagating the positive side of that, as well as making sure that you have a backstop against the negative side of it?
Yeah, a couple of things. Communications, more than ever before now, has to be two ways. You have to sit down and have listening sessions. The more employees feel like they're being listened to, not talked at, the less likely they are to pose a threat to you, and or leave and or steal intellectual property. So listen, communicate more than ever. But I'm a security guy at heart, so I say trust but verify. I have to tell you, it's time to do that kind of data migration analysis. Your IT people, if you're in the C-suite, start asking them, what are we seeing in data migration out of the company? They'll know what you mean. What are we seeing with attachments going out the door in emails? Are employees sending emails to themselves at home with attachments? That's intellectual property likely going out the door. You got to get on top of that.
Yeah, wow, makes perfect sense. All right, Frank, last question for you. You've spent a lot of time in government. You've also spent a lot of time in business and consulting with businesses on some of these issues, how to maintain public trust, how to make sure that their information is safeguarded. What would you say are the key ways that business and government should be working together as we enter this new era? We've got a new administration. We've got trust levels at a very, very low point. Business obviously needs to do more in partnership with government. What would you say are the concrete actions that business should be taking in the next 6 to 12 months?
First, ask yourself what it now means to be that good corporate citizen, because I believe it's changing slightly. I believe we need an all hands on deck, holistic approach to this problem of domestic extremism, of global instability, of polarization. And you see this stepping up that the big tech firms, the platform providers, are finally doing. They've made a call. I've consulted with some of them because they're concerned about the two-edged sword. Take down this platform, force people into an echo chamber that we can't see. But they are taking a hard stance now, saying We cannot support this. We cannot stand for this. I would ask each company on the call to start some introspective looking. What is it we're uncomfortable with? What's coming down the pike that we can get out in front of by disassociating with it now, or having a hard conversation with a supplier? The other thing I want to talk about real quick is we've just lived through the largest cyber compromise in the history of the United States. Russia intelligence services found that single point of vulnerability in SolarWinds as a provider of network management, which, by the way, had clients across the most sensitive agencies in government, and they attacked that. It's time to go to your supply chain people and ask this question. Are we reliant wholly on one provider for some critical good or service that if it went down, it would pose an existential threat? I cannot believe that the US government agencies all had SolarWinds as one single provider. Rest assured, you're going to see more attacks like that. There's every indication Russia is going to challenge Biden very quickly on a massive cyber attack. Don't you be the one that's crippled because you relied on one single source somewhere for any product or service in your company.
Yeah, I mean, it's an atmosphere that requires vigilance from both sides, right? For business, and this is a big theme that we talk about a lot. How are you getting out in front of government that you're actively solving the problems before government tells you to or regulates you to do so? And I think we saw that across the board in the first few weeks of 2021 between what was happening with the PAC contributions, was happening with the platforms shutting certain actors down. And I think for government, it's this question of your reliance on business and where that exists and where the supply chain is. And I think we're going to see that term supply chain risk management come up again and again based on exactly what you're saying and the threats that we're currently facing.
Yeah, look, here's a reminder. The SolarWinds compromise was first detected by the private sector. And that's been my experience, by the way. I came out of the big, impressive FBI. I went to the private sector. I was impressed with the ability that they had way out in front of the government. So it's time for your people to engage with the government in a kind of partnership saying, we're seeing this, just so you know, what are you seeing? And that two-way dialogue will be very helpful.
Yeah, and it's that competence factor, right? On vaccine distribution, we saw just a couple of days ago, Starbucks and others making a commitment to say, okay, look, we've got a lot of expertise here. We've got expertise in logistics. We've got expertise in how to move people through a space. So let us come help you, government, and help you figure out how to distribute this vaccine. And I think that's a lot of the thinking that we're going to see moving forward here.
No question. And a disturbingly high percentage of Americans don't trust the vaccine. Businesses can play a role here simply by saying, we're going to set up a way for you once the tier comes down and there's mass availability. We're going to set up a vaccine line here at the office. Our medical department or our outsourced nursing staff is going to help get this done for you. We're going to talk to the county health department. Just that trust you have in that CEO and my employer saying, okay, they want us all taking the vaccine. They're going to facilitate us taking it. That goes a long way.
It goes a long way, and facilitating it while, of course, maintaining individual freedoms, which we also know are very important to our survey respondents. That's a delicate line. The words you use to communicate are a delicate line, but it's certainly something that will be a challenge for business to rise to the occasion in the coming months.
Lots of challenges ahead, but I'm encouraged that this barometer is saying that, you know what, business can play a major role here. Don't lose the moment because it could be lost quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it go up and down for business over the past couple of years, over the past months of 2020 even. So it's a big moment for business and a big moment for us to see what happens from here. Thanks so much, Frank, for having us. Really appreciate your time, appreciate your thinking today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our next guest. We'll continue talking about the results of this year's Trust Barometer in the weeks to come. Thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful Monday.